Okay, well, I have 12:01, so let's go ahead and get started so we don't waste anybody's time. But I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sherry Tischer, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development for our staffing practice here at Scale Funding. We're thrilled to host this webinar on scaling your staffing firm with MSPs, which is a crucial topic for anyone looking to grow and succeed in the staffing industry. We hear the excitement, but we also hear the frustration and the questions that our funding clients and prospects have about working with MSPs. So I've had this webinar topic on my radar. It's been on my list for over a year. But when I have an idea for a webinar topic, until I come up with the right presenter with the right content, it sits on my list. Well, the wait is over and I found the right presenter. So today we have Kelly Boykin, founder of Growth Curve, who will be sharing her expertise and her insights. Prior to starting her advisory firm, Kelly spent over 25 years in the staffing industry. She has a distinguished track record of building and leading sales and delivery organizations across many staffing verticals and throughout North America. So just to list a couple of her accomplishments, she's a certified contingent workforce professional through Staffing Industry Analysts. SIA also puts out an annual list called Global Power, 150 Most Influential Women in Staffing, and Kelly has been a 3-time honoree of that list. She's also active with the American Staffing Association, where she's been a subject matter expert for their new training product called ProStax. She has chaired the Women in Leadership Council, been a member of the Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Advocacy Group, and a longtime mentor in the Mentor Match program. Oh, and if that's not enough, she co-authored the book Together We Rise alongside a group of female leaders in the industry, and all of the proceeds from the book and related speaking engagements are donated to the ASA Scholarship Program. So bottom line, Kelly has helped numerous firms from brand new startups to the largest creative and marketing staffing firm in the world streamline their MSP channel strategy, uncover opportunities to drive revenue, and double the number of programs that they serve. So Kelly, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And by the way, it sounds so great when you say it. I might just bring you along to every place I go and just let you do that. So thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me today. This is a topic that obviously I spend a lot of time with, and a lot of staffing firms are asking about this. And you'll hear me clear my throat some, by the way. I've had whatever summer allergy thing everybody else has had. When I talk to staffing firms about MSPs, I imagine this being the conversation bubble over their heads, right? I think it's scary. There's lots of opportunity. I can grow, but then what about fees and how am I going to do this? And so I can resonate with it because it's exactly how I felt when I really began working with this industry channel a lot more closely. But today we're not going to solve all the world's problems, but we're going to demystify some things and really narrow in on a few of the ways that we think we can help people think about it differently, so that it makes a little bit more sense. So we will cover very briefly, in whatever you can do in 50 minutes, the why. We'll talk about contracts themselves, the commercials, which of course always the most interesting thing or scary thing, depending on how you look at it, the relationships themselves, and expansion. So that is on our docket for today, and really looking forward to jumping into all those things.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. And then just a little housekeeping too, before we jump into the content here. We are recording the session, and then by the end of the week, our marketing team will be sending out an email with a link to the recording along with the slide deck. So you guys will all have that in your hands. And then as we go up throughout the next few minutes, I'll be guiding the conversation by asking Kelly some really targeted questions about this material and about these 5 topics. But as we go along, as you have your own questions, feel free to enter those into the Q&A box. And at the end of the session, we've saved a few minutes. We'll make sure to address those questions. So let's start out with the basics, Kelly. So why should staffing firms consider partnering with MSPs? What are the key benefits that they can expect?
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about we'll talk about some of those benefits as we go. I think the most important thing to think about here is, why would a company engage an MSP to begin with? I have spent the last, what feels like 400 years in staffing, and I remember when MSPs really weren't a prominent thing. And then they've, of course, gained a lot of traction and momentum over the past decade or two. So I think the starting point is to understand that customer's perspective. Why does the customer have them? And when it comes down to it, it's really this somewhat ugly graph that's up here, and it's called QECR, quality, efficiency, cost, and risk. These are the problems, generally speaking, that an MSP would be solving for a customer, some combination of those things, right? And so it's important and helpful to kind of think about that middle diamond as a rubber band. So if a company end client says, we want to increase our quality, they're probably not going to decrease the cost at the same time. We've all had those companies, those clients that have felt differently, but we all know you can't increase quality while you're decreasing cost. Similarly, if you want to get people in the door faster, you want to make the talent acquisition process much more efficient, you could potentially put some risk issues out there, compliance. You're probably not going to become more risk compliant while you're making things faster. So I show you this because it's important to understand, first of all, why they're there. But then as you're talking to your programs, helping yourself to understand why they are there specifically. Because as I said, every program is going to be different. And if you are talking to a program that says, we are here predominantly to reduce costs, that tells you something about what your pricing and commercials could look like. And it also tells you that they might be accepting lower quality, but getting it at the people in the door at the lowest cost is important. And so that should inform your thought process around if you want to join and how you would partner with them in going about that. So really it's understanding the why they are there, and many conversations you can have as a result of that start to change the dynamic of how you're working with an MSP program.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. Okay, moving on to contracts. So contracts are often seen as one of the most challenging aspects of working with MSPs. I think they can feel very one-sided for staffing firms who are looking to partner. What are some key red flags staffing firms should watch out for as they're reviewing these contracts that MSPs have?
Yeah, it's this, and the commercials are certainly top of mind for folks. If you are, and I'm going to somewhat interchangeably think about MSPs and then large enterprise customers that might have an internal contingent labor program, because they are going to be similar in a lot of these areas. When you are a retail focused, small to mid-sized customer focused staffing firm, you might be able to use your own contract frequently. Less and less these days, but you still may be able to use yours largely. When you get into these larger programs, you are using their contract. There's no way they're going to sign yours. And some of them can be 50, 60, 90 pages long. And so it's important to know what to do with them. Some staffing firms have a legal department or an outsourced legal function that helps them through this, but many don't. And so it could be the owner, it could be the president, it could be a salesperson that's looking at these contracts. And there are some sticky areas. So I won't go into every single thing here, but when we look at it, these are the broader areas that you really want to pay some attention to as you're talking to them. And I'll give you some for examples. More and more, companies, the end client in particular, they want to assume as little risk as possible. And so their goal is to push as much risk to the staffing supplier as they can. So those indemnification sections, the limitations on liability, who that MSP, who that clause or that contract is going to cover. Typically it covers the MSP and the customer, but sometimes there's an other. It might be and their affiliates. And so really understanding who else is this covering that we need to be aware of. So the risk piece is always there, and it's always huge. The invoicing things, right? And so we know that you're going to have predominantly VMSs that are serving these customers. So how quickly do you need to submit an invoice? And what is the window you have to dispute that invoice? Because if you're not staying on top of your internal processes, you could find that it's a very quick window and you don't have the opportunity to dispute things after the fact. What are the SLAs that they are asking you to deliver on? Are those things reasonable? Are they achievable? And almost more importantly, is there a financial penalty if you don't achieve those? Because that becomes huge. They could ask for, a fraction of the bill paid back to them. It could be any number of things. So are there penalties, particularly financial ones, for not hitting those SLAs? Audits happen, of course, with these large accounts. How frequently are they happening? What kind of access are they requesting to your database? Right. And that sometimes doesn't appear obvious, but are they looking to be able to go into your systems to do this audit? And who's paying for the audit? The candidates themselves, ownership of the candidates. I always hate using that word, but candidate conversions, how quickly can they convert? What does that risk look like for you, especially if they're converting without a fee? And the last thing that I'll jump into is on the client side, sometimes maybe 50% of the time we'll see clauses where they're asking you to not compete, meaning you can't work with another one of that client's competitors. But you'll also see language which is most favored customer language. And what that means is they are asking you to treat them as their best customer and give them the lowest pricing. And that is very difficult for us to deliver on as staffing suppliers. So these are just a few of the things to really look for as potential red flags. Drill into, make sure it makes sense for your organization, that you're set up to operationally deliver on it, that you have the kinds of insurances that you need to, and that it makes sense for your business as it pertains to that particular program. Yeah.
Okay, if you don't mind me interrupting here, just because one thing that's really jumping out at me that we see a lot, like when you're talking about the invoice deadlines and time to submit, not only time to submit, but what does that structure look like? Like, does the MSP send the invoice to the client company only once a month, but yet as a staffing agency, you're paying your people weekly? And so that's a huge consideration for a lot of staffing owners, because there's that bigger gap then between when they're going to get paid on that invoice versus when they're paying their people. So either if you're self-funding your business, do you have the cash flow to accommodate those invoice payment terms? Or do you have a funding partner or a bank or whatever that can help you support that during that process? But we find that a lot with staffing agencies as they're working with MSPs, that can be problematic. It's something to consider.
Absolutely. And there also can be language, and usually is language, that you're going to get paid when they get paid.
Yeah.
And so the MSP needs to receive payment from the customer, and then they'll turn it around to you. And so, yeah, understanding how that works and what your ability is. And we'll talk about the commercials in a moment where that comes up as well, but totally agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to profitability. Of course, profitability is always top of mind for any business, but it seems like a lot of discounts and fees and different things can be built into the program. So how can staffing agencies ensure that they're maximizing profitability when working with MSPs?
Yeah, the first step is really going to be understanding what these areas are, and not making assumptions that something is more or less profitable until you really dig in and look at the implications. And I always recommend having some sort of a pro forma or worksheet that you and your team are able to use, where you can plug these things in and run it through to the bottom line and see what that impact is going to be. But the obvious things that we think about contractually, commercially, are going to be the markup. What's the markup? Is there a bill rate card, a not to exceed rate card? One or both of those is very common. And if you see both, that's particularly tricky, because there's kind of boxing you in on both sides, right? And so you need to understand what those look like. MSP and VMS fees are also going to be in there. And for the most part, by the way, these are not things that are negotiable. When we talked about the contract terms, some of those things you can negotiate. And I should have said this when we were there. Most of the time, those things are flow downs from the end customer. So, not to defend my MSP friends, but we get grumpy with them sometimes for these agreements. Usually these are flow downs from the customer themselves. So some things can be negotiated, some can't. But the MSP fee, as an example, that is the only revenue stream for the MSP. that is the only way really that they're making money. And so that's probably not going to be negotiated down. But understanding what that fee range is, a range of 1.5% to 3.5% is typically where that is. Is the VMS fee built in, or is there an additional fee for that? So those are the things that are obvious. But on top of that, there are discounts, and these are going to hit the revenue line almost immediately. Are there tenure discounts where after a talent's been out on assignment for a while, you have to lower the bill rate and keep the pay rate where it is? Are there volume discounts for how much business they're doing with you each year? And by the way, be on the lookout to make sure that those things reset every year, because I have seen agreements where that clock starts ticking at the beginning of the relationship. So then you're always paying a volume discount going forward. So something important to watch for. As you mentioned a little bit ago, the payment terms and the cash flow. So what do the payment terms look like? How long are they asking you to float payroll? Because really that's what it is. We're paying weekly and they're going to pay the MSP at X number of days, and the MSP is going to pay you at Y number of days. And you need to ask those things, particularly when is the MSP turning it around to you, the pay when paid. And then also, are they asking for early pay discounts? And do you want those? There are staffing firms that don't need the cash flow immediately, but they don't want another discount taken off of that rate. And so understanding those early pay discounts. The compliance piece. So are they requesting background checks, drug tests, any other screens? Who's paying for those things? Is that you? And if so, what is that going to look like? Particularly if you're having to do that on every candidate you're submitting versus ones that they're hiring. Different things to kind of think about. What are those penalties? If there is an audit, as I mentioned earlier, and you are out of compliance with some of those things, are you paying? Is there a financial penalty, and are you financially responsible for anything that goes wrong? Are you paying for the audits? And then the last thing that I'll mention here, and before I bring you back into this conversation, is around the talent pay. This has gotten more and more complex over the last few years because states are doing things very differently. So number one, wherever you are working, make sure you understand the states that you are going to be supplying talent in, which we always would. But what are the paid time off and sick leave requirements for that state? And who is paying that? Are you paying that and passing that cost on to the client, or are you absorbing all of that? Because those are mandatory costs that have to be paid in those states. And similarly, overtime and double time, it's not uncommon at all. Most of these contracts, by the way, are written with large volume segments in mind, like IT. And so many of those folks are exempt workers, but ours almost always are not outside of that category. So what does overtime and double time look like? Is there a multiplier for that, or are they expecting the same rate regardless of the number of hours worked? Legally, we have to pay overtime and double time. And so that is you can immediately be upside down on any overtime hours if it's not worded properly into the contract. So again, all of those things said, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables, and it can be very overwhelming, especially if you're working with multiple programs, to understand the financial and commercial impact on you. But before we jump to a conclusion that the gross profit isn't high enough, it really is smart to dig in and look closely at the numbers. So this is a very rudimentary version of a P&L statement, right? We have revenue at the top, take out our direct talent costs, and that gives us our gross margin. And then your operating expenses, those SG&A expenses, and then profit, right? I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't already know there. But elements can impact this very quickly. So for an example, with these large companies, and these large programs, you are potentially going to have a lot higher volume. That drives that revenue number up. But you also could have the fees and discounts that take it, that reduce and impact that revenue, which is going to impact that gross margin. But just because gross margin is lower on some of this business, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not as profitable, because you may have the opportunity with efficiencies to have a lower cost of sales. Your cost to acquire a customer, your cost to acquire each order could be potentially lower. Your commission and bonus structures could be very, very different because you're not necessarily going to have a salesperson hunting for each order. And if you are structuring your business in an efficient manner, you also might have efficiency savings there. For instance, using offshore or other ways of partially supporting that recruiting process drives those costs down. So it is very possible, although your revenue and your gross margin could be impacted, you could have an operating expense that's lower that ultimately gives you a reasonable, acceptable bottom line profit. I will tell you this, though, if you are looking at MSP or large enterprise business, and your thought is, I'm going to run it through the exact model that we use for our high touch retail customers, it's not going to probably work for you financially. There is no way of doing that and realizing the kind of profit that most staffing firms want. And so it is looking at it and approaching it differently, particularly on those operating expenses. And I'll flick back to this because I meant to bring you into this conversation because you did just say this. I know you guys, for your customers, that cash flow piece is huge. And depending on the size of a staffing firm, if you are not able to just free float money for months and months at a time, this is a great opportunity to work with a partner like you all, because you might want to engage in a customer like this. This could be a non-starter for some companies if they don't have a partner in place that can help them get through that initial dry period where the cash flow isn't happening.
Yeah, very true. Thanks. Yeah, we see that all the time, Kelly. And then going back to your previous slide, Kelly, too. I mean, I learned this lesson in my first year in the industry. This was a hard lesson to learn because it was a large bank that we were staffing for. It was a multi-million-dollar account, but at the time we didn't know any better, right? So we were over servicing it. We were paying all the fees. We were paying all the drug and background screenings out of pocket. And at the end of the day, we were losing money on the account because of how it was structured. And so when it came time to rebid on the project, our group vice president here locally said, I'm not doing it. And I remember the president of our company saying, Sharon, how are you going to replace, $20 million in revenue if you don't bid on this? And I remember her saying, Gary, I don't know how I'm going to replace $20 million in top line revenue, but I sure as heck know how I'm going to replace $100,000 a year loss, because she knew, she could tell from her own P&L that we were losing money on the account. And to this day, I remember that conversation, and it was an interesting lesson to be learned.
It really is. We can get excited about those big brand logos and we want to work with them. And that has a value itself. But when that situation that you just described happens, you have a couple options. You can go back and renegotiate some of these things so that fees and discounts don't look the same. You can streamline your operations so that those operating expenses are in line enough to drop enough profit. Or you can walk away, because not all business is good business. And I am absolutely not in the business of ever convincing everybody to do work in the MSP channel. It does not work for every staffing firm. And so really the options that you have there are really important to understand so you can make those good business decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's wrap up with client relationships. So obviously very key in any business partnership, but it seems like when working with MSPs, there's that layer of complexity because oftentimes we're blocked, for lack of a better phrase, we're blocked from reaching the client company hiring managers or the HR department. So we're working directly with those MSP partners. So what strategies can staffing firms put into place to build and maintain strong relationships directly with the MSP program?
Yeah. And I do want to address the no contact thing. It can be terrifying for staffing firms, very frustrating. And I've actually written articles about this. I'm a big believer that it actually doesn't help anybody. It's worse for the customer too. That said, I will say that if you have an agreement that says you can't, no touch, that doesn't necessarily mean no touch. There's a lot of gray space in there. And so don't assume that you can't talk to anybody ever at the end customer. You might be able to. That said, though, building these relationships with the MSP starts with one really important thing, which is they're not the enemy. And that's a mindset change sometimes for us in the staffing industry, to think about them not as that barrier to success or obstacle, but they are a partner, they are an end customer. And so just like you would with your end customers, it's very helpful to understand what they look like and how they are structured. And it's different from how we're structured. So there are three functional areas within an MSP. Of course, it changes by MSP, but generally speaking, it's going to look like this. And so I'll start with operations. That's the one that we're the most familiar with. Those are the programs themselves. And so most staffing firms are working day to day with that program coordinator, program administrator, the person pushing work out the recs out the door. Sorry, light flickering here. And that's very helpful to have at the beginning of that relationship, except that those are not the individuals that are making strategic decisions. They're quite honestly trying to survive the day. They have a very tough job. And so trying to talk to them about how do we grow? How do we get into something else? Wrong person to talk to. And that's going to be the theme of the next couple of slides. Who are you talking to and what do they care about? But this is where the programs roll up. So a program manager owns a program. A program leader runs multiple programs, and so on up to the C-suite. So that's operations. The supply chain organization is different. Their job is bringing suppliers into programs so that every program has the right supply mix. If a company starts to see the need for new and additional skill sets that aren't currently in the supply chain, their job is to go find the right suppliers and bring them in and onboard them, and offboard suppliers that aren't performing, that are not hitting scorecard KPIs or SLAs. Or for any number of reasons are not performing to the extent where they want to optimize them out. So supply chain, the operations folks really only have visibility into the programs that fall into their universe. So if you go to your program manager and say, hey, can you help me get in this other account? Not going to be something that they can help with. Not their universe. Supply chain has visibility into all of the programs that MSP would be working with. And so different conversation, different thing that you're going to talk to them about, but that's their visibility. And then the third channel functional area is business development. And we largely ignore that. We largely think, well, those are salespeople. What does that have to do with me? They're responsible for acquiring new MSP programs. Sometimes those are Gen 1 programs where it's a new program where they've never had an MSP before. And sometimes they are stealing those programs from each other. There's enough penetration now out there. I think 77% of the Fortune 1000 use an MSP. So more of that stealing is happening. But what they care about, and I'll kind of move over to this, is going to be different from what the other groups care about. So kind of coming back to where I just started. So the program teams, the operations teams, they care about the end customer, that customer being happy. They want to keep their customer happy. And so how you're doing in the program, very, very important to them. They're also concerned with adoption. They want to know that the hiring managers are bringing requests through the program and not outside of the program. Again, that's their only revenue stream. So they want to make sure that they are driving adoption. They're doing a good job for the customer. So that's what they care about, right? And so your approaches to them around how can we do better? How can we help you solve problems for your customer? What is important to you all right now? And even where you can identify areas that may not be adopting to the program, how do you help them grow that program? That's the way to talk to an operations group. Supply chain, as I said, cares about having the best suppliers in the programs at any given point in time. So talking to them about success stories that you're having. If you're working with a program, as an example, a financial services, a bank customer, and that's the MSP program you're in, having those success stories within that is very, very helpful. But being able to bring that back to supply chain and saying, look what we've done here. Look at this cool thing that we helped them accomplish. Where might that apply to other customers that you are currently looking at the supply chain for, that you as an MSP are managing? So they are looking more broadly at what does the overarching supply chain look like, and how do we make sure we have the most high quality suppliers? Business development, as I said, they're looking at closing business. And so what they want to do is they want to have something new to talk about. They want to have a differentiator themselves. The MSPs are it's getting to be a crowded space. So how can they go to a customer and talk about a unique problem? So where you're supplying information to them, where you're letting them know, hey, I heard this company is considering an MSP. Or if you have a unique value prop that they can leverage as they're approaching these customers, that partnership becomes important, because if you help them get in that program, guess where you're probably going to end up having an opportunity in that program. That loyalty and those relationships are really important. So again, it's important to, yes, we know in the staffing industry how to form relationships with our end customers, translating that to the MSP, understanding how they're structured, understanding what they care about in these different areas, so that our approach, our questions, our solutions make the most sense for that entity, is really going to be very helpful in furthering that relationship. At the end of the day, we all care about us. And so we care about, these folks are always concerned with how do they accomplish what they need to for an end customer.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Now let's talk about growth. So how can staffing firms leverage MSPs to expand their business?
Yeah. And so everybody's concerned with growth right now, the entire industry. If you look at any of the articles coming out, it's always focused around, we've been stalled out, we're not growing the way that we were before, so on and so forth. So when it comes to any kind of growth, obviously, if you're looking to do anything, there are steps you're going to take. But with MSPs in particular, let's start by looking at what MSP programs typically look at and cover. This graphic comes from SIA. I did not make it up myself, but this is the 2023. This is the average MSP program in North America, and these are the categories that they would align talent to, right? And so I'm showing you this because it's helpful to see the size, the numbers of categories, the things that are actually being run through an MSP, and also which categories are larger than others. Not necessarily, though, to say, oh, IT is the largest category, that's what I need to get into or move my business or expand into, because it's a very crowded space. Just because it's larger doesn't mean that that's where more opportunity lies for you. 25,000 staffing firms in North America. It's a staggering number of staffing firms. And so the competition is certainly tough. And so if I was looking at expanding business, I wouldn't necessarily jump into IT or healthcare. I would look at some of these other categories that might not be as crowded, that might be underrepresented. And I would look at the programs that I'm in and look and speak to them about what is their category alignment look like? What are they covering for this customer? And where does that opportunity lie? So for growing, and this is similar for how you would look at all of your business, the first thing, if I'm in a program and I'm doing a good job, because the first thing is you have to do a good job. You're not going to grow if you're not doing a good job in delivering quality talent. That's sort of a no-brainer there. But looking at these existing programs and saying, all right, I have a relationship with this MSP. Where are you all struggling to get the right talent? What's a pain point for you all? What categories could we expand into that might help grow our business, but also solve a problem for that program? So growing the categories themselves within a current program, growing the geographies within that current program. So you might be set up as a supplier in one or two cities or locations, but do you understand all of the locations that that program is covering? And can you cover any of those? And is that a conversation that you can have with them, particularly around some cities and some states are just harder to cover. Some states, a lot of suppliers don't want to cover. And so maybe there's opportunity if you're willing to do that. The next is looking at the programs themselves. So as I was saying earlier, if you're doing a good job in a program, and then make sure that you're talking about that story across the MSP themselves. So if I'm top of my head, if I'm in an Allegis program or a magnet program and I'm doing a great job with those, I want to make sure that I am getting in as many Allegis and magnet programs as I possibly can. So do I have a strong story? Am I telling the right people in those parts of the organization, specifically supply chain there? Am I telling my story so that they think about me to be considered for other programs? And then finally, other MSPs. So if you're not doing any MSP business, it's not a great, easy time to jump in. It's not saying it's impossible, but it's not easy. It was a little bit easier a few years ago. So approaching an MSP that knows nothing about you, it's not a quick thing. This is a little bit of a longer roadmap. However, using the example that I had earlier, if I'm working in a large bank's program and I'm doing a great job and I have those stories to tell about the problems I've solved, then I can also go to other MSPs that have banking clients and say, by the way, here's what we were able to do here. I want to make sure we're on your radar because your banking customer is probably having similar challenges and we can solve those for them as well. So, I mean, the bottom line ways to win and summarizing a lot of things that we've said here is, and additional things, is first and foremost, you need to have a clear strategy within your organization. And by that, I mean, if you want to go after MSP business, that needs to be clear at a leadership level all throughout the organization. You need to communicate it because I have seen and been in situations where there's not enough buy-in within the rest of the organization to doing this, and it's never going to go anywhere. So having a strategy and communicating that strategy, treating the MSP as a client, not as the enemy, but they are a client, which means getting to know them, knowing what they care about, speaking their language so that you can solve the problems that they are looking to solve is going to be super critical. Know what you can and can't do. What are you good at? And do those things. Don't try to be all things to all people. There are, a finite number of staffing firms in North America that are generalists that really cover every category. Most of us don't, and that's okay. That's good. But stick to what you can do really well and do it really well. Treat this business differently. As I said earlier, if you want to think about and treat MSP or large customer business the same way that you do high touch retail business, and with the same staff, it's going to be very challenging and very frustrating for everybody, especially those staff members. It's a different recruiting process. It's a different sales process. So think about it uniquely and make sure that you're structured accordingly. And then last, but probably most important, is you need to do a good job and you need to exceed the expectations of those programs to begin with so that you have those stories that you can tell and grow based on.
Wow, Kelly, that was a lot of great information. And if anybody
has a lot of me talking.
It was, no, but that's why you're here. That's why I asked you to do this. If anybody has any questions, feel free to enter those into the Q&A because we do have a little extra time. So as you're thinking about those, I don't see any questions in there right now, but I have a question for you, Kelly. And this is thinking back to that slide that you showed about the structure of an MSP. And you had it separated by supply chain and operations. Yeah, that one right there. Okay, so you had mentioned that the people who make the decision as to whether or not to let you into another MSP program that they might be managing would be in supply chain. But if your relationship currently is in the operations section, right, with program coordinator or maybe the program manager, could you give the audience a tip on how to get over and connected with somebody in supply chain? Like, is it as simple as just asking that program manager, who in the organization in supply chain could I talk to about expanding our partnership with you? Or, I mean, is there anything that you can suggest there?
Yeah. And it might be as simple as that. In supply chain is there is a supply chain person or alignment for every program. And so asking that question, but backing up a little bit, when you entered the program, probably the people you were talking to, you might have had the program manager in there some, but probably a lot of the folks you were talking to were supply chain folks, from looking at the compliance and the contracts to getting your profile set up, your capabilities set up, what are the things that you can do? And so you might already have some of those names in your email, unless you've been in it for a long time and you don't have them anymore. But yes, then going to those programs, if that is the only person that you know, then going to those programs and saying, we want to make sure that we're doing a good job for you as a partner. We want to make sure that we're in great standing with your organization. Can you connect me to the best supply chain individual that I can talk to about that? And like anything else, they will probably connect you at a somewhat lower level. And so then it'll be your job to continue to expand those relationships and make sure, in ideal world, people that are leading supply chain, people that are leading multiple programs as a program leader, and people that are their best salespeople. That's what your goal is, but take some time to get there.
Okay, great. In the meantime, we've had a couple of questions come in. So first question, what steps would you advise a company wanting to start working with an MSP for the first time? So I'm guessing more of a sales related question, like, right, how do we get in? How do we get in and start for the very first time?
That's always the $100,000 question, because as I said, it is a crowded space, and it's not a short thing. That said, what I would do, and I hope if there are any MSPs on the phone, they can just mute and walk away for a moment while I'm saying this. What I typically have always suggested folks do is take a parallel approach to breaking into a customer. If you want to work with, and I'm making this up, Bank of America, that's probably a bad one because that's a pretty big program. But if you want to work with them, I would pursue both the MSP and the company at the same time. Most of the time, what you'll hear from the MSP is, we're set for now. We'll do an RFP in a couple of years. We're fine. That's what you're going to hear frequently. But the end customer regularly is getting suppliers added to a program based on some need that they're having or some problem that they're having. So building those relationships, like anything else, research that company. What are they talking about? What are they building, launching, doing right now? What's out there in social media or articles that they're talking about? It's pretty easy when you're an expert in your space to say, if they're building this thing, they're going to need these kinds of people. And I know some of those that are going to be really hard to find. And so having those kinds of conversations with the end customer, very frequently, to the detriment and the frustration of the MSPs, really frequently a hiring manager might come to an MSP program and say, hey, we need to onboard this supplier because we need them for A, B, and C. And they're the ones that can do it. And so it can kind of happen through either door. Aside from just the day-to-day sales piece of things, I think, and also, especially if you are in a visible role or you're a leader, building your brand externally and getting to know those folks in a relationship building way, especially supply chain, they get sold to all the time. And so the last thing they want is suppliers chasing them around and just trying to talk about them, So understanding what that company is trying to achieve right now, what those supply chain folks are looking for, and just building your brand overall. Sometimes it's being in the right place. Sometimes it's meeting them at a conference, and it's not easy. But breaking in when you have no MSP business isn't always easy. Sometimes what also happens is you're in a large program and they end up deciding to bring on an MSP. And once you have your foot in the door with one program, it's easier to mushroom that out, as we said earlier. So I hope that was helpful. No silver bullet. I'd be a very wealthy woman if I had the answer to that, but hopefully that gave a little bit of insight.
No, but I'll concur with that, Kelly. I see that a ton where agencies get in because of a relationship with the hiring manager. They've got a candidate that the hiring manager wants, so the hiring manager goes to the MSP program and gets them signed up. Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Okay, here's the next question. If we are brand new into an MSP program and don't really have a great story yet or performance, right? What's the best way to continue to explore other programs within that same MSP?
Yeah, I mean, the answer I'll give you may not be the one that this person is wanting to hear, but the first thing I would say is if you're new in a program, build that relationship with that program and ask those questions. Maybe you don't have a lot to build on yet, but when you go to a program team and your conversation isn't how can I grow or how can we do something for me, but it's I want to understand you as the individuals on this program. What are your concerns? What's keeping you up at night? What are what's going great with you serving our mutual end customer? What's the challenge that you're having? How can we be a better partner? And when the conversation starts with how can we be a better partner and supplier, is very different. It's received very differently than how do I get me more business, right? And nobody really responds to that very well. And so building those relationships within and being successful. If you're in a program, you're new and you're not successful, it's going to be very hard to get them to go bring you into new programs. So have success where you are and create those stories. We think about, sometimes we overthink what a story is going to look like. It's not necessarily this big complex thing, but where do we build relationships? Where do we deliver great talent? Where do we have hiring managers saying great things about our talent? And then escalating that from there. So I would say a little bit of patience. I would say being really successful where you are, building the relationships up that program channel is going to be very, very critical. Asking the questions in a partnership way of how can we help you? And keep in mind that the operations folks don't know about other programs. So also, while you are in that program, reaching out and making sure you know who supply chain is, make sure that they know the successes you're having. It might be as simple as we had a good scorecard, right? That's great. And so you want to make sure that the supply chain folks know who you are and what you're doing. And I'll say this last thing, part of their job in supply chain also is to help you. Once you're in a program, they are a resource to help guide and help you navigate to success because they need you to be successful. They want you to. So they are an advocate. So having that open dialogue and saying, here's what we've done great, here's what we've not done. Ideas help. Who should we be talking to? Leveraging them in really that two-way relationship. Because they're going to remember it now when they're looking at other programs that they're trying to build the supply chain for.
Okay, one more question, Kelly. MSPs are presented as vendor agnostic. I've noticed that some MSPs have their own staffing wing. What are your thoughts on the conflict that creates?
Do we have 3 more hours to talk about this topic? Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, there's vendor agnostic and there's vendor neutral. And those are different things. Vendor neutral is supposed to mean no supplier in a program has an advantage over another, meaning they all get their X at the same time. Everybody has the same opportunity. It's been bastardized over the last few years to kind of mean nobody can talk to anybody, and that's really not the purpose of vendor neutral. So that's what vendor neutral should look like. Vendor agnostic, not dissimilar to that. There are staffing firms, there are MSPs, many of the larger ones that came from staffing firms. So Manpower, that Tapfin is Manpower's MSP solution. Pontoon is Adecco's MSP solution. And so you certainly have a lot of the larger ones that grew out of a staffing organization. Ronstadt as well. Now it starts to become tricky because some of those are really good at being neutral there and not playing favorites. In fact, I have seen surprisingly many situations where there's an adversarial relationship between the staffing firm and the MSP under the same leadership, because there might be just this assumed expectation that they get in there. So some of the MSPs, I'm not naming any names here, but some of them are much better about being neutral in that regard. There are a few large MSPs that are pretty open about the fact that they will also bring in their staffing supplier. And so this is where you need to understand the nature of the relationship. Are you tier 1? Are you not tier 1? When are the recs coming to you? So for instance, there are situations where the recs are going to go to their supplier first, and their supplier might have a day or a week or whatever to work on those recs before you ever see them. I have personally been in situations where we didn't know that when we entered into this. And it took a couple of years of us trying to figure out what the heck is going on before we asked the right questions and got to that. And we may not have joined if that were the case. So within one particular MSP, they have 2 types of programs. They have programs that are vendor neutral, where all the recs go to everybody at the same time. And they have programs that are not, where their staffing firm gets those recs first. And so asking the questions and understanding those things is going to be really, really critical at the end of the day, they are going to almost always have their staffing firms in there, but you should still be able to be on a level playing field. And if you're not, you need to know that going in.
Okay. Which kind of goes back, Kelly, to what you were talking about earlier, is understanding what that structure and what those agreements look like so you can make the best decision for your firm. Maybe that's not the program you want to be a part of. Maybe you want to go after a different MSP program, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions in the box. So I guess we'll just at this point, thank you again, Kelly, for presenting your insights and your expertise in this space. Thank everybody else for joining the call. And if you have any further questions on this topic, don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.